Good afternoon, first of all. Thank you for being here once again. Thank you to Meredith and everybody here at Mentor Public Library for having us. Yet again, we're pleased to be here every month on the second Wednesday. Now, in this case, because of the title of this presentation, it would have made more sense to do it on the third Wednesday, but that would just confuse everyone. So just imagine that it's a week from now and it's June 19th, and you're going to hear about all these really interesting events that took place on June 19th. This program series that we've been doing for several years now is called Leaders and Legacies of the Civil War Era. A lot of what we're going to talk about today happened a lot more recently than the Civil War, but a lot of these things do have their roots in the Civil War era. There are a few things that are very specific to the Civil War here, but this is one of those rare programs where we're actually going to take it forward. So we're going to go all the way up to things that happened, not all that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And I'll go ahead and ruin the surprise and tell you that as I was putting this program together, I realized that there were a lot of events I needed to talk about in order to make these June 19th events make sense that didn't actually happen on June 19th. So maybe I should have called it the significance of June in American history. But since I had billed it as June 19th, I thought that I would just leave it as is. So not everything we're going to talk about here happened specifically on June 19th, although a lot of these things did. We'll go through like we always do, and then of course, as always, at the end I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. So we'll start with, of course, because I work at James A. Garfield National Historic Site, I have to somehow interject James Garfield into just about everything I do. And this has nothing to do with the subject at hand, but I'm just kind of letting you know what James Garfield was doing on the one June 19th that he served as President of the United States. So this is a quote from Garfield's diary on June 19th of 1881. He was not at the White House at this point. He was actually down in New Jersey. His wife had been sick with malaria, and she was getting better, but they had eventually decided to take her down to the seashore in New Jersey, hoping that the climate there would be better for her health. And I'm sorry to say that this was not the only time during the summer of 1881 when a member of the Garfield family was taken to New Jersey in the hopes that the climate there would prove restorative to their health. James Garfield was also taken there after he was shot, which happened just about 2 weeks after this diary entry was made. So Garfield writes in his diary on June 19th, 1881, "Passed a restful day with manifest betterment in her strength," referring to his wife Lucretia. "The worry and work of Washington seems very far away, and I rest in the large silence of the sea air. I have always felt that the ocean was my friend, and the sight of it brings rest and peace." For those of you that didn't know, a very young James Garfield, when he was a young man, a teenager really, actually dreamed of leaving the Western Reserve, leaving Ohio, and going to sea. He wanted to be a sailor. And the furthest he ever got, of course, was working on the Ohio and Erie Canal, where he promptly fell in and got sick and decided that maybe he wasn't going to be much of a sailor after all. But Garfield always did have a great affinity for the ocean, spent a lot of time in the summers, even when he was in Washington as a congressman, spent a lot of time going to New Jersey and other places and spending time at the beach, just like a lot of us still like to do today when we have vacation time in the summer. So here's Garfield on June 19th of 1881. Now let's go back 19 years and see what Garfield was doing in June. Again, this is June 14th, 1862, not June 19th. But in June of 1862, James Garfield was a brigadier general in the Union Army during the Civil War. And he was down south. He was on campaign, basically, with the Army of Ohio. And he was marching through, at this point, through Mississippi. And he wrote this letter to his wife, Lucretia, on June 14th of 1862. And if you know anything about Garfield, if you've been down the street to our site, if you've come to any of these talks before, you know that Garfield was very, very vocally anti-slavery. The other thing that's interesting about Garfield is that he was convinced from day one that the Civil War was about slavery, and he was also convinced from day one that abolition of slavery needed to be something that the Union said it was fighting for. What's the point of fighting this horrible war if the root cause of it is still going to exist at the end? If we declare a peace with the Confederacy and slavery still exists. So Garfield was actually quite frustrated at this point when he wrote this letter in June of 1862, because at this point the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation had not been issued by Lincoln, and the Union Army was marching through places like Mississippi, which is where Garfield was when he wrote this letter, and they were not able to free slaves. So Garfield writes in this letter, "No one who sees the splendor and luxury of these wealthy planters' homes can fail to see that slavery has great charms for the rich, but it is the poor man's bane. We pass these fine plantations and see the slaves toiling for masters and master sons who are in the rebel army fighting us, and we let them stay at their toil. I could chill, I could chill your blood with the recital of horrors that have resulted to slaves from their expectations of deliverance and their being abandoned to death at the hands of their overseers." So Garfield's very frustrated at this point that the Union Army doesn't allow his soldiers to free slaves as they're marching through these places. And he's saying, we pass these plantations, we see slaves continuing to be enslaved, and they expect us to free them. And we can't do it. And these slaves who try to escape and go to the Union lines, once they're recaptured, they're very often, whipped or beaten to death or something perhaps even worse. So Garfield's expressing great frustration here about not being able to do anything about what he calls the poor man's bane, the institution of slavery in the South. Now let's go back a little bit. Again, this is not an event that took place on June 19th, but let's just review probably, of course, the most famous passage of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Abraham Lincoln held the Declaration of Independence as the true founding document of America. A lot of people in the South who were pro-slavery preferred to look at the true founding of America as the Constitution. Because the Constitution does what? It protects property rights. And in their mind, slaves are property. And therefore, forget about all men being created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They much prefer the Constitution because the Constitution protects private property, protects the institution of slavery. Oh, and by the way, is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? How many times is the word slavery mentioned in the Constitution? Does anyone know? 0. But is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? This is a quote from Article 1, Section 2. "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included within this Union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including these bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons." This is the 3/5 compromise. So you'll recall that during the Constitutional Convention, there was all this debate about how do we distribute or apportion members of Congress. Every state has 2 senators, right? Doesn't matter if you're, giant California or Alaska, or if you're tiny little Rhode Island or Delaware, you have 2 senators. But in the House of Representatives, we apportion based on population, which makes sense, right? Larger states have more representatives because they have more people that need to be represented. Makes sense. So large states with large populations wanted slaves to be counted as population. People from small states or people who were anti-slavery said, that doesn't make sense. You're not giving them civil rights. You're not allowing them to vote or own property. Why would slaves count as members of your population? So this language right here is the 3/5 compromise. It's the compromise that those 2 sides came to, that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of population and therefore the purposes of apportioning representation in the House of Representatives. So the next time somebody asks you, is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Or at least it was. It's not anymore. That's why in the Gettysburg Address, where Lincoln talks about the need for this new birth of freedom, he says 77 years ago. He dates the founding to the Declaration of Independence. This was in November of 1863. 70 is 80 years. 7 is 87 years. So 87 years back from 1863 is 1776. So Lincoln is taking the beginnings of the country, the founding of the country, not from the Constitution, but from the Declaration of Independence. And this is where he talks about the new birth of freedom, talking about the fact that the country has to do better. It has to be better. That's why we're fighting this war. By November of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation has been announced, has been enacted for almost a year at that point. So this is Lincoln really trying to explain to the American people in 262 words or whatever why we're fighting this war. And of course, you know, Lincoln's not even the keynote speaker that day. He's almost an afterthought. He's invited to make a few appropriate remarks, and he speaks for about 2 minutes and speaks 262 or so words. The guy who was the keynote speaker that day spoke for 2 hours. Does anyone know a word of Edward Everett's speech from the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg? But everybody knows 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and so on and so forth, right? Everybody knows that. How many of you had to memorize that in school when you were younger? I know I did. I grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, so makes a lot of sense that I would have to memorize it since I was, you know, my high school was like a mile from where this took place. So anyway, that's the new birth of freedom, and that is why Lincoln says 7 years ago. So he's dating the founding back to the Declaration, not to the Constitution, even though the form of government that he is the head of as President of the United States, the form of government that the Union is fighting to preserve, started with the Constitution, but Lincoln still takes the founding back to the Declaration. 7 years back from 1863 is 1776, not 1787 when the Constitution was approved. So let's get to our first June 19th event. So on June 19th of 1862, during the Civil War, Lincoln signs a piece of legislation that prohibits slavery in federal territories. And this basically nullifies the Dred Scott decision, which had come down from the Supreme Court in 1857. So if Lincoln issues a proclamation on June, or signs a piece of legislation on June 19th, 1862, saying slaves everywhere are free, is that really going to ensure freedom for slaves? Of course not. You think Southerners, members of the Confederacy, are going to release their slaves because Lincoln's? No, of course not. They consider Lincoln the head of a foreign country at that point. So the only place Lincoln really can prohibit slavery at this point is federal territories. These areas that are not yet states, but they are territories of the United States. And I think I have a map in here. Well, not quite. So this is really the only place Lincoln can do this at this point, and at least be sure that it's going to be followed. The background on the Dred Scott decision, this was issued in March of 1857. Dred Scott, who you see there on the right, was an enslaved African American. He had been the property of a guy who was a surgeon for the U.S. Army, and so this guy was, traveled all over the country in his capacity in the Army, and he had taken Scott to a number of places where slavery was illegal or slavery did not exist. He had taken Scott to free territories. So Scott decided to sue for his freedom, saying he should have been free as soon as he stepped foot in a free territory that didn't have slavery. And of course, the case was originally heard in St. Louis, at the old courthouse in St. Louis, which is now part of Gateway Arch National Park, which is part of the National Park Service. Scott lost, of course, and the case wound its way through the courts all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in March of 1857, the Supreme Court issued its decision, and they ruled against Dred Scott. But they went a lot further than that. This guy right down here is Roger Taney. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, and he wrote the majority decision for the Supreme Court, in which he said, among other things, they, meaning African Americans, black people, they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So this is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court basically saying, Black people have no rights and no opportunity to gain rights because they can't be citizens. They really shouldn't even interact with white people except in a slave and master relationship. Something else that the Dred Scott decision said, that Taney's majority opinion said, was that Congress has no right to legislate where slavery can and cannot go. So all of these territories that you see here in red, Congress had no right at all to say slavery could go there or could not go there. That wasn't Congress's role. And based on this, then theoretically, those areas could all be opened up to slavery. Southerners, at least according to the Supreme Court at this point, had the right to expand, to go into those territories and take slavery with them. And this really could have led to a very slippery slope where, at what point would Southerners stop and, say, oh, well, we're going to go now, instead we're going to go to Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and places like that, and we're going to take slaves with us because the Congress has no right to legislate where we can and can't take our slaves. So this was a major, major event in American history and a major event on the road to the Civil War. And what Lincoln did oops, let me go back one because that's a good one too. What Lincoln did on June 19th of 1862 in his capacity as president was say that slavery now was not permitted in all of these territories. That nullifies the Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford. So here's the Cornerstone speech, or an excerpt from the Cornerstone speech. This is just a few years after the Dred Scott decision. This is Alexander Stephens, who's at this point, when he makes this speech, is the vice president of the Confederacy. So this is just before the Civil War begins, just a matter of weeks before the firing on Fort Sumter. He gives this speech in Georgia, where he's from. And it's pretty powerful, not necessarily in a good way, but it's a powerful speech. And he says, the new Confederate Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. So here's Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, saying, the Civil War is about slavery. Secession was about slavery. He's saying it right here in this speech. The 1781 Constitution, that should be 1787, my apologies, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly argued against the constitutional guarantees thus secured because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. So he's saying that even though the Constitution of 1787 does permit slavery under the Three-Fifths Compromise, it doesn't go far enough in the minds of Stephens and Confederates. Our new government, the Confederate government, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. So the next time somebody tries to tell you that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, this is a great primary resource that you can point to say, according to the Vice President of the Confederacy, it did. Jefferson Davis made similar comments. Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, and lots of former Confederates then after the war decided it probably isn't going to play well in history for us to say we were fighting for slavery, so let's just say it was all about a constitutional disagreement and it had nothing to do with slavery. But their words have followed them in history, so we can tell for sure that according to what they thought when the Civil War began, it was secession was all about slavery. So Lincoln's approval of the June 19th, 1862 legislation prohibiting slavery in federal territories rejects this. And this is really one of the steps on the road to the new birth of freedom that he talks about in the Gettysburg Address. It guaranteed freedom in the only place that Congress could at that point, and that was the federal territories. And of course, as I say there in the slide, Congress couldn't legislate for southern states at that point because southern states had declared themselves seceded and didn't recognize the authority of the U.S. government. And of course, this is a precursor to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which comes about 3 months later after the Union victory at Antietam, when Lincoln then codifies that we're going to go even further than what we've done with federal territories. We're going to say that if the Union wins the war, of course, slavery will be gone everywhere, not just in the territories. Our next June 19th event is June 19th, 1865, right as the Civil War basically is coming to an end. And this is when Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and let African Americans in Texas know that the war was over, the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued 3 years prior, and that they were now free. African Americans in Texas had no idea that any of this had happened. Of course, it was incumbent upon slave owners to keep slaves uninformed, uneducated, and ignorant of what was going on in the world, and certainly this is a prime example of that. So this is the order that Granger put out on June 19, 1865 from Galveston. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, meaning President Abraham Lincoln, who of course is 2 months in his grave at this point, all slaves are free. This involves absolute personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either here or elsewhere. And this is by the order of Gordon Granger, who was arriving in Texas to take over command of that part of the former Confederacy in June of 1865. And this is the day, that's why June 19th is now known as, among African American communities as Juneteenth. It's a celebration of the end of the Civil War, and really a commemoration of the end of slavery in the United States. Of course, the war had been over for a while already. You know, the Lee surrendered in April. There were additional Confederate surrenders in May, and I think even a small one in June further west. So slavery itself was rapidly coming to an end. Juneteenth, or June 19th, is the day that a number of African American communities sort of took up their celebration of the end of slavery, and still is a popular holiday among African American communities today. And as you can see there, it's recognized in 45 states, and in Ohio is one of them. Ohio just recognized Juneteenth as a day of commemoration fairly recently, I think just in the last 10 years or so. So it's a fairly recent addition to Ohio, but as of today, there are still 5 states that don't recognize it, and I don't know what 5 those are off the top of my head. So if that's going to be your question at the end, I can save you the trouble, because I'm not, I saw it as I was preparing this, but I don't remember what they are. So now we're moving a little bit forward in history. We're going to look at another June 19th event, which may seem like it has nothing to do with any of this, but it does, and I'll tell you why here in a minute. On June 19th, 1945, again, we're way past the Civil War at this point. We're now 80 years past the end of the Civil War, and we're right at the end of World War II. Dwight Eisenhower came back to the United States as, of course, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. We just had the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day last week. D-Day was, of course, the invasion of Europe that basically moved Allied forces into Europe and then allowed them over the next year to advance on Germany and eventually destroy the Nazi war machine and win the war in Europe. Eisenhower comes back to the United States, and on June 19th, 1945, a massive parade, victory parade, is held in New York City. Eisenhower, of course, is the guest of honor at this parade. 4 million people line the streets to see Eisenhower. This is just, really a month and a half or so even after the surrender of Germany. The war is not over. Of course, the war in the Pacific is ongoing. That doesn't end until August, after the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But at this point, the war in Europe is over, and Eisenhower is being hailed as a great American hero. And as we often do with our heroes, everybody wants him to run for president. Eisenhower is kind of like reminiscent almost of U.S. Grant. 80 years before. The war is over. Grant is the most popular, most revered man in the country, and everybody wants him to run for president. Nobody has a clue if he's a Democrat, a Republican, or something else. The same thing with Eisenhower. These guys are professional soldiers. It's not their job to be involved in politics. They had never said publicly what party they were a member of, or even if they were a member of a party. So both parties pursued Dwight Eisenhower, first in 1948, but of course Eisenhower at that point is still, he was still on active duty for a while. Then he became the president of Columbia University in New York City. So he's not interested in 1948. 1948 is the year that everybody expected Harry Truman to get buried, and then the famous Dewey defeats Truman photo where he's holding up the paper. So Truman manages to win the election of 48. Truman could have run again in 52 if he wanted to. Keep in mind, Truman became president not by being elected president, but when FDR died in April of 1945. Truman was vice president. He'd only been vice president for 3 months. He becomes president. He's not elected to that term. So really, the first almost complete 4 years of Truman's presidency is him filling out the term that FDR had been elected to. So Harry Truman could have run again if he wanted to in 1952, but he was ready to be done and go home to Missouri and enjoy the rest of his life. So everybody again comes calling to Dwight Eisenhower's door in 1952. He finally admits he's a Republican. He finally is able to be talked into running. He runs as a Republican in 1952. Even though at this point World War II's been over for 7 years, he is still the most popular and revered man in the country, just like U.S. Grant was when he finally decided to run in 1868. And Eisenhower, of course, wins election in 1952 and wins re-election in 1956. So he serves a full 8 years, 2 full terms as President of the United States. Incidentally, Eisenhower probably could have been elected to a 3rd term. The Republicans kind of shot themselves in the foot after Franklin Roosevelt. They decided no more of these guys running for unlimited terms. Roosevelt was elected 4 times. So the Republicans are the ones that really pushed the constitutional amendment saying that presidents could only serve 2 full terms. And then immediately the next Republican president is Dwight Eisenhower, and he could have almost certainly been elected to a 3rd term if he'd wanted to. There's some people that feel that Eisenhower, Reagan, Clinton, and perhaps Obama might have had a chance at a 3rd term if they'd been able to run for them. Whether or not that's true, I have no idea. It's all an exercise in futility anyway, because none of them were allowed to run for 3rd terms. But at any rate, what does any of this have to do with the Civil War or race relations? Well, it was Harry Truman, when he was president, that ordered the integration of the U.S. military, but it was Dwight Eisenhower that really had to implement that, had to make sure that it was going smoothly, and that it was not going to prevent the armed forces from doing the job that they needed to do. So up until after World War II, military forces were segregated. Black soldiers served with black soldiers, white soldiers served with white soldiers. So it was during Truman's one elected term, I should say, when he ordered the integration of the military, but Eisenhower is the one that had to do a lot of the Eisenhower administration had to do a lot of the heavy lifting on that and make sure that happened. And then almost immediately, the Korean War takes place. The Korean War actually started in 1950. So the integration of military forces really was put to the test almost immediately when Truman was still president, when he sent American forces to fight in the Korean War. And then Eisenhower is the one that had to continue to deal with that conflict and had to bring that conflict to a close. And the Korean War is kind of considered a draw. I mean, if you look at where the lines started and where they ended, they're pretty much the same. We lost, 35 or 40,000 Americans in combat in Korea, and it's still called the Forgotten War. It's because it's right after World War II, and it's kind of right before Vietnam. It's kind of sandwiched there in the middle. But it also is the first time that the Cold War really became a shooting war. And of course, there's all this speculation that had the Korean War not happened, it's possible that the next war might have been a nuclear war. But anyway, this is the first time that American military forces had to actually fight on the ground in a large-scale military conflict after integration of the armed forces. And the fact that Korea ended up as kind of a draw has nothing to do with the fact that the armed forces were integrated. So as far as combat testing, integration of military forces, it was no question a success. There are a number of other incidents that take place during Eisenhower's term. One of the most famous is 1957, when, of course, the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in 1954. That ordered the end of segregation in public schools. The Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that separate but equal does not exist, and certainly not in public schools. And so from 1954 on, once that decision came down, schools were supposed to integrate. And there were a number of places in the Deep South where that was resisted strongly. Little Rock, Arkansas was one of those places. So by 1957, there were a number of African American students who wanted to go to Little Rock Central. It was the best high school in the city. There were a number of black students that wanted to go there, and there were both Arkansas National Guardsmen preventing them from going to school there. There were also white citizens who were preventing them from going to school there. And so President Dwight Eisenhower finally sent military forces, the 101st Airborne, into Little Rock. And you can see, this is some very famous photos here of the Little Rock Nine, the 9 black students that integrated Little Rock Central High School, being escorted into the school by armed soldiers. So this is a major event in the civil rights movement that really began with the time of the Civil War. We have the anniversary of this just yesterday, June 11th of 1963. This was the confrontation at the University of Alabama. This is Governor George Wallace right here, who had said in his inaugural address upon becoming governor of Alabama, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. The University of Alabama is also attempting to be forcibly integrated by black students who want to register to go to school there. And George Wallace physically blocks the door of the registration building and stops these black students from going into to register for classes. This gentleman here was the commander of the Alabama National Guard, who technically works for the governor. The National Guard is controlled by the governor of the state. And so this gentleman actually works for the governor, and he has to basically tell the governor, we're supposed to let these African-American students in. The governor says absolutely not. So what happens? President Kennedy at this point, Eisenhower has finished his term. Now John F. Kennedy is president. Kennedy nationalizes the Alabama National Guard, places it under federal control, and then this general has to now come back and tell his boss, now you have to move. The law says you have to move. And Wallace did eventually move, and that was the integration of the University of Alabama. The very same night, just hours after this confrontation at the University of Alabama, John F. Kennedy addressed the nation talking about civil rights. Kennedy had been criticized by a number of civil rights leaders for being far too slow to act on civil rights. By June of 1963, Kennedy had been president for about 2.5 years, and he had not taken many active steps to really help the civil rights movement. And so he was being criticized publicly for that. And finally, on the evening of June 11th, 1963, just hours after the confrontation at the University of Alabama, the president addressed the nation, and among other things, he said, "This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal." There we go back to the Declaration again, which again is where Lincoln felt that the country began, not the Constitution. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is the land of the free, except for the Negroes? So this is President Kennedy finally kind of getting on board with the civil rights movement and now starting to call for a comprehensive civil rights bill that will expand civil rights protections for African Americans. The very next day, June 12, 1963, 56 years ago today, Medgar Evers was assassinated in front of his house in Jackson, Mississippi, while his wife and children were in the house. He was a World War II vet, and he was working with the Mississippi chapter of the NAACP to register black people to vote. And he was shot and killed in front of his house. The house is now Medgar Evers National Monument. Was declared a national monument by President Obama in the last few years. And there was a conviction in this case in 1994. 31 years after the murder, they finally convicted a white supremacist named Byron De La Beckwith, who had already been tried twice. They finally convicted him of this murder in 1994. And then he died in prison around 2001, I think. Of course, you're not supposed to be able to be tried twice for the same crime, but the charges were different each time, and there was different evidence each time too. So it took 3 trials because it was clear that he had done it, but he was, of course, acquitted by 2 all-white juries. But then finally in 1994, he was convicted and he died in prison in 2001. So, of course, we all know in November of 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated. So President Kennedy does not live to forward this civil rights bill that he first addressed the nation about on June 11th of 1963. So Lyndon Johnson becomes president, a white Southerner, but Johnson decides that making the Civil Rights Act a priority is not only the right thing to do for the country, but he sort of bills it as a tribute to the memory of President Kennedy. No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill, for which he fought so long. So Johnson's guilty of a little hyperbole here, I think, because we all know after, in the last few minutes, that we've learned that Kennedy really didn't fight that long for a civil rights bill, basically from June until he was killed in November. But Johnson is very slyly, I think, calling up Kennedy's memory, saying, we should do this, 1, because it's the right thing to do, and 2, because it will honor the memory of President Kennedy. I kind of liken this to Chester A. Arthur becoming president after President Garfield is killed, and Arthur telling the people that comprehensive civil service reform is the right thing to do, but also will honor the memory of President Garfield, because Garfield had begun to come around to the idea of the need for civil service reform before he was killed. So this is a good sort of modern parallel to that. Southerners, of course, did not like the idea of this civil rights bill, and as soon as it was introduced in the Congress, Southern senators began to filibuster the bill, and they filibustered it from March 30th, 1964 until June 19th, 1964. So they filibustered it for almost 3 months before finally the Congress was able to end the filibuster, send the bill for a vote, and the bill passed the Senate on June 19th, 1964. So the bill that was passed, the Comprehensive Civil Rights Bill of 1964, was actually a compromise. The original bill that Southern senators really objected to and continued to filibuster, from March 30th until June 19th, was actually a lot further reaching than the one that they ended up passing after they were able to end the filibuster. So they actually sort of pulled the bill back and reworked it a little bit and worked out some compromises in there, but Southerners still opposed even the compromise bill and continued the filibuster because they didn't want any kind of civil rights legislation being passed by the Congress. Here are just a couple of Southerners who opposed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Richard Russell from Georgia: "We will resist to the bitter end any measure or any movement which would have a tendency to bring about social equality and intermingling and amalgamation of the races in our states." And he was a Democrat from Georgia. And then Strom Thurmond, who was in the Senate until about yesterday, I think. He was, Strom Thurmond was in the Senate for decades. I mean, I guess he probably died, 10 or 15 years ago now, but he was there for a very, very long time. And he was a Democrat at this point. He became a Republican later, but he was a Democrat at this point. This so-called civil rights proposal, which the president has sent to Capitol Hill for enactment into law, is unconstitutional, unnecessary, unwise, and extends beyond the realm of reason. This is the worst civil rights package ever presented to the Congress and is reminiscent of the Reconstruction proposals and actions of the radical Republican Congress. So here's Strom Thurmond reaching back to the Civil War and Reconstruction era to, and really kind of encapsulating what a lot of white Southerners felt after the Civil War. Now, what is the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 asking for? It's asking for equality for African Americans in voting and in other areas. It's really not today, I don't think anyone in this room would consider this particularly radical. But in 1964, to white Southerners, this is very radical because it is helping bring about equality between black and white Americans. And white Southerners, a lot of white Southerners, not all obviously, are very much opposed to that. This is Hubert Humphrey, who was a senator from Minnesota, also a Democrat. So interestingly, whereas today we tend to see the parties really stick together regardless of where the representatives or the senators come from, Humphrey is also a Democrat, but he's from Minnesota. He's not from the Deep South. He's from the North. So Humphrey, and of course Humphrey was later a presidential candidate himself, ran against Nixon in 1968 and lost to Nixon. Humphrey was the Democratic whip in the Senate at this time, and Humphrey is the guy who was really responsible for trying to end this Southern filibuster that went from March until June of 1964 on the Civil Rights Bill. So Humphrey worked nonstop for months to try to bring about an end to this filibuster and get this bill before the Senate for a vote, and finally was able to shut down the filibuster. He needed 67 votes to end the filibuster, and on June 19th they took a vote and he had 71 votes. So he was able to end the filibuster, and then at that point the bill passed the Senate, and then President Lyndon Johnson signed it into law on July 2nd. It outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin, prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations. Again, in 2019, doesn't sound particularly radical, but when you consider the state of society in the United States at that point, it was pretty radical. Now, had those radical Republican Congresses that Strom Thurmond mentioned in his comment been successful in trying to do what they wanted to do after the Civil War, none of this stuff would have ever been an issue. But because even though slavery was abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union wins the war and therefore slavery is over, did that mean 100% equal rights for black people once the Civil War ended? Of course not. Of course not. And particularly after Reconstruction ended and federal troops left the South, white Southerners were free to openly oppress African Americans once again. That's where we get the black codes, all of these very restrictive laws about where black people could go and what they could do, and all of the crazy property and literacy requirements that they had to be able to demonstrate in order to vote, even though at this point the Constitution had been amended to say every man, not women at that point, sorry ladies, but every man is able to vote, regardless of the color of their skin. But white Southerners did not agree with that, and were free to really enforce those black codes and continue to oppress African Americans in the South for decades. And so here we are 80 years after the end of the Civil War, still fighting a lot of those same battles. So did we really get the new birth of freedom that Abraham Lincoln talked about in the Gettysburg Address? In some ways, yes. In a lot of ways, no. And then where do we go from here? And of course, I don't know the answer to this question, but it's just some stuff to think about. Another horrible June event was the Charleston church shooting. You may remember that back in June of 2015, when a self-proclaimed white supremacist who was obsessed with the Confederacy and the Confederate flag walked into an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot 9 people. And he said, he was hoping to start a race war between blacks and whites. So this is the church right here in Charleston where that shooting took place. And then down here we have, 2 years after that, we have the events in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017. This was called a Unite the Right rally. And you see Confederate flags right alongside Nazi flags there. Did you know that the swastika and Nazism in general is illegal in Germany? It is illegal to fly that symbol in Germany. And yet, here's the current flag of the state of Mississippi. Today, 2019, the Confederate flag is part of the Mississippi state flag. Here's Silent Sam. This, until very recently, was a statue that was located on the campus of the University of North Carolina, which has a huge African-American student population. And this was a statue that was promoted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was a women's group that was responsible for a lot of the pro-Confederate. Confederates were noble and honorable and only fighting to protect their view of the Constitution. A ladies' organization that was responsible for a lot of this sort of warped history we have now of the Civil War era. So they were the ones that were really behind this statue being erected on this campus. And it was dedicated in June, the month of June 2nd, 1913. And the keynote speaker that day was a white supremacist, a member of the KKK, and a Confederate veteran named Julian Carr, who gave a predictably white supremacist speech when the statue was dedicated. This statue really became kind of a flashpoint here in the last few years. A number of very angry students, white and black, demanded that it be taken down, and it actually was taken down here just in the last year or two, I think. They have since removed that from the campus. And then, of course, Martin Luther King, the best known and most revered of the civil rights leaders. I love this quote where he says, "All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they hadn't committed themselves to that there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of the press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And this is from a speech he gave on April 3rd, 1968, and he was assassinated the next day. This is a photo from the I Have a Dream speech in August of 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial. Near and dear to our hearts for a lot of reasons. The Lincoln Memorial, of course, is part of the National Park Service, and we have a park ranger standing right here. So I always like to point that out, that the Park Service is there for a lot of great moments in American history. So this is King speaking in Memphis. He was there to support a sanitation workers' strike. And of course, a lot of those workers were African American, not all, but in addition to racial justice, King also was a champion of a lot of different social movements. He championed unions, and he was against the Vietnam War, and so a lot of different social movements that were kind of coming to a head in the late 1960s. And of course, a lot of those had direct impacts on African Americans. And so it's understandable that these are things he would be interested in learning about. And then finally, just a final note that, we've come a long way in this country. I would never say that we haven't, but I don't think we've come all the way. And I don't know if we will when any of us in this room are still, upright. So it's, the fight for equality is unfinished. I think it's a necessary one. I think we need to keep fighting it. And I think all of these events that took place mostly on June 19th, but not exclusively on June 19th, in the month of June, we'll say, are good reminders about what that struggle is, why it's important, and what the future of it may hold. So does anyone have questions about anything that I can try to answer for you about this, anything in here today? Yes?
At the beginning, you were having one of those quotes quotes and it said, not for Indians. Were Indians held at a lower status than slaves?
Well, Indians were considered savages, and they were not enslaved per se by white Americans like black people were, but they were viewed certainly as less than equal to white people, and uncivilized, unchristian savages who, really the history of American relations with Indians is just as ugly as it is as American relations with African Americans. So, no, there were, not that I'm aware of at least, any or very many Indians technically enslaved by white people, but there were a lot of states, now keep in mind you're talking about the Constitution there, 1787, there were plenty of the states at that point that still had Indian populations. So what they were basically saying here is, Indians, I don't remember the quote exactly, did the Indians count for population or not count for population?
No, not.
Yeah.
Like your second slide.
Well, it says untaxed.
I think it was your second slide or something like that.
Including those bound to service and excluding Indians not taxed. There you go. So Indians were not counted as part of the population.
When were we given the vote?
Who's that? Indians?
Yeah.
When were Indians given the vote? Well, the Dawes Act passed in the Dawes Severalty Act. That was 1870s or 80s, I think, which basically made American Indians citizens, which of course should have given them the vote, but really didn't because they didn't have white skin. But the Dawes Act basically was kind of yet another swindle for American Indians because, hey, you're citizens now, so American citizens don't get reservations, so we'll go ahead and take all those lands back, and now you can live on 160 acres or whatever.
It was our land in the first place.
What's that?
It was our land in the first place. Why should we have to take it back?
Who are you talking about?
The Indians.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, obviously. Okay, sure. No, you're right that.
Picking on you.
No, that's okay. Because you're right. I mean, as I said, this history is just as ugly as the history of slavery. That white people came here and basically took land that Indians had lived on for generations, and tried to, over the years, to turn Indians into white Christian farmers, which is ridiculous because Indians had completely different conceptions of land ownership and really didn't view land as something that could be owned by one individual. It was communal property for everybody. And so then eventually, moved Indians onto reservations, and the reservations, while not what the American Indians would have chosen for themselves, at least, okay, these are our lands, we can be here and we can continue to live the way we want to live traditionally. And then the Dawes Act comes along, 1887, I think, something like that, and basically says, oh, you're all citizens now, and therefore we'll go ahead and take these lands back because citizens don't live on reservations. Ha ha ha. So it's kind of, it's just another swindle by the federal government. There's a great, I don't know if anybody watches Parks and Recreation. It's like it's one of my favorite. It's on Netflix, and there's a great episode there where they're trying to plan this big event, and they have this relationship with the local Indian tribe, and they're trying to get the Indian tribe to agree to this, and the guy who's the head of the tribe finally says, an Indian making a deal with the government. What could possibly go wrong? So I'm like, yeah, there you go. So I always look for the history jokes in there. So yeah, I mean, you raise a great point. I mean, that history is just as ugly as the history of the way that black people have been treated as well. Any other questions from anyone? Sure.
This isn't a question, it's a comment.
Sure.
Had the U.S. paid the slave owners like the British did, it would have averted a lot of problems, if they compensated the slave owners, and freed the slaves and compensate the people, because that was their economic thing in the South.
Yeah, maybe. I think certainly you're right to a degree that more Southerners would have been willing to consider that. But there was more to, first of all, slavery was hugely profitable. I mean, the amount of slave property that was owned in this country, even at the beginning of the Civil War, was in the billions of dollars. It was so a lot of people have tried to show, slavery was barely profitable. That's all baloney. It was a very profitable industry. But once cotton became the primary crop it's a very labor-intensive product, and wealthy white plantation owners did not want to go out there and pick cotton themselves. So they really, really heavily invested in slaves because slaves were needed to do that work. So there's that. The other thing about slavery is, and a lot of people who try to talk about the fact that the war had nothing to do with slavery will say, well, the vast majority of Confederate soldiers were not slave owners. That is true. Only about 25% of white Southerners owned even a single slave. But the thing about the institution of slavery was it was the foundation of not only the economic system in the South, but the social system as well. So even poor white Southerners who never, ever owned a slave could always say, I am not the lowest rung on the ladder in society. There are people below me, and those are the slaves. So even though it's true, the vast majority of Confederate soldiers did not own slaves, that is 100% accurate. It's not true to say that they were not, therefore not fighting for slavery. I think a lot of soldiers probably didn't give slavery a second thought, Confederate soldiers. They were being told by political figures, by important people in their communities, the North is the aggressor. The North wants to take our property. The Constitution protects our property, and our property happens to involve slaves. I think a lot of them probably went to war for that. But to say that they weren't fighting to perpetuate slavery is still not, in my mind, accurate, because it was such an important part of not only the economic fiber of Southern society, but the social fiber as well. Now, that is not to say that all Confederates were slave owners. They were not. 25%, if that, of white people in the South owned slaves. But it was such a major part of Southern society that certainly they were fighting to keep that system in place, no question. And Alexander Stephens and many others openly admit that. I mean, you saw what he said in the Cornerstone speech. The cornerstone of our government, of our system, rests on slavery. This is the Vice President of the Confederacy saying this is what we're fighting for. Go ahead, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
I was going to say, I heard that General Lee was really not necessarily for slavery, but in his case, he was such a loyal son of Virginia. So there's some issues there with.
Well, Lee did own slaves, so he was a slave owner, and Lee, after the war, certainly encouraged Southerners to accept the fact that they had lost and to try to put the country back together as best they can, but privately had some very unkind things to say about black people, but also about the radical Republicans and Reconstruction. So he was not quite as magnanimous, I guess you'd say, as the public face that he put forward. He was by no means the most offensive or aggressive of white Southerners. There were plenty of people who were a lot worse than him, but he tried to portray himself as kind of above the fray, and to a degree he was, but he was a slave owner, and he had beaten slaves and all this, so he's not quite as innocent as maybe he wanted people to think he was, but yeah, I mean he resigned from the Army at the beginning of the war and basically said, I'm going back to Virginia because I can't fight against my native state, and I will never raise my sword again except in her defense. And then, of course, early in the war, the Union marches into Virginia, and in his mind, that meant he needed to defend Virginia. So, sure.
The Lees and slavery, though, go back to the Revolutionary days.
Sure.
The original Lee. I mean, he was Robert Lee.
Lee's wife was a great-granddaughter or a step-great-granddaughter of George Washington.
Is that the Custis?
Custis, yeah. And George Washington was one of the largest slave owners in Virginia at the time. So, there's this, it's ironic that, and hey, the founding fathers were Don't get me wrong. I mean, they're to be revered for fighting the revolution and for creating the Constitution. What I don't like is this idea that anybody who criticizes the founding fathers is un-American, isn't patriotic, whatever. I think it's the most patriotic thing you can do is to say, yes, these were great men, but they were men. They were human. They had failings. Yes, they lived within the system that they had known for their whole lives, but they're not infallible. They're human beings. None of us are perfect. So to say that anybody who criticizes Washington or Jefferson or whatever because they were slave owners, that's ridiculous in my mind. And there's a great quote from a British. I don't know if he was a writer or a politician, and I think this was right around the time of the American Revolution, when the founding fathers are sending off declarations of independence and all this stuff, and talking about the tyranny of King George and all this stuff. And this guy in Britain says, "Why is it that we hear the loudest cries for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" And it's a pretty perceptive comment, if you ask me. Of course, slavery still existed in Britain at that point too. The British didn't get rid of slavery until the 1830s or so, but they certainly did it long before the United States. So, any other questions? Sure.
Yeah, another comment.
Sure.
Did you see the play 1776? And they kind of portray the fact that in order to have enough of the then colonies come together, that it was an issue brought up, the issue of slavery, but they couldn't get the southern colonies to join with the revolution unless they kind of said, well, we'll deal with that later. At least that's,
oh yeah,
kind of.
No question. Washington and Jefferson and those guys all kind of kicked the can down the road and basically said, this is going to be an issue. We don't know how to solve it right now, so we're going to hope that the next generation figures it out. There's no question about that. Jefferson basically wrote that this is going to be a problem for the Union, but we don't know how to deal with it right now. Primarily because if we just make a blanket statement saying we're against it and it's abolished, a lot of those southern colonies and southern states would want nothing to do with it. So you're absolutely right there. No question that they knew that this was going to be problematic. And in fact, one of the little passages in that cornerstone speech from Alexander Stephens that I took out just for space was where he mentions Thomas Jefferson by name. And, Jefferson, of course, was a Southerner, a slave owner. He's revered by Southerners, and by the time of the Civil War. And, he's one of those guys that Stephens says they were wrong. They didn't go far enough to protect slavery. And Jefferson, he mentions Jefferson by name. Jefferson's called it the fire bell in the night, that this issue that was going to come up again and again and again until it was dealt with. And obviously, he was right. It did. Sure.
Was there never any slavery in the North?
No, there was slavery in some of the, yeah, sure. Never as many slaves in the North as the South. Land in the North was, farms were not as big. You didn't have massive plantations. And also the climate in the North was so different. It really wasn't conducive to growing things like cotton or rice or tobacco, some of these staple crops of the South that really required massive amounts of labor. But yes, there certainly was slavery in the North. Absolutely. It was, by the time of the Civil War, not so much. It was pretty much done by then. But remember, the first anti-slavery piece of legislation was the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, when the Continental Congress, really as they were still talking about the Constitution, passed the Northwest Ordinance, organizing the Old Northwest, Ohio, Wisconsin, some of these areas, that are now those states that we know. And they said, no slavery shall exist up there. So that is guys like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all, passing legislation, before the Constitution's even enacted, prohibiting slavery in certain parts of the country. And of course, Southerners were very, very unhappy about that, but they did it anyway. So, yeah, I think Jefferson and Washington and guys like that, they knew it was going to be an issue, but they basically admitted they didn't know how to deal with it. And, they probably felt like, okay, we've done what we can do here. it's going to have to be the next generation that figures that out. And it was a few generations down the line before it finally came to a head in the Civil War.